Yeah, we did get some rain this week, so that was good. So decent amount. All right, we're gonna keep going in Ecclesiastes. I'll recap a little bit about what we talked about the last few weeks here first. So last week we read chapters 1, and we got a little bit into chapter 2, and we start with Solomon's thesis in here. He's got a couple thesis statements that he makes kind of throughout here, but his overarching one is everything is meaningless, and if you kind of append to the end of that, everything is meaningless without God. Like is going to be like, because he's going to start this whole thing with everything is meaningless, and he gets to his conclusion at the very end. So if you stop with his thesis statement, you'd be like, man, that was the least encouraging sermon or least encouraging study ever going through that. So don't stop there. Like you got to keep going until the end here. The author establishes he's got expertise around this. So we talked about it's most likely Solomon writing this, or the writings of Solomon here. He states his expertise in several places here. So and when I say expertise, he's qualified to speak on this topic of all these things being meaningless because he's done everything, he's had everything, he's known everything that there is to be known. He's the king of Israel in Jerusalem, so he's the king of Israel before the kingdom is divided. He's been blessed with greater wisdom and knowledge than anyone before him. We know, of course, when he's asking for blessings from God, he asks for wisdom, and God blesses him with wisdom. He's extremely wealthy. He notes a number of things that he has more than anyone else before him. And he's experienced all that pleasure could offer. We read in other places here that Solomon had over 700 wives and 300 concubines. I don't know, like, so he's tested and experimented way to the far extremes of like anything that could be done or should be done. And then he discusses 3 areas that he's going to conclude are meaningless. He talks about work, and he says work is meaningless. And again, like append work, like if you're putting work out there and thinking like I can work and I'm just going to keep working and working and working, and that's my path to kind of satisfaction and happiness, you're putting something into a dead end. And we've probably experienced that at times where we've been like, all right, I'm going all in on this thing or this promotion, and you get to the end of that thing and you're like, what was that for? Like that really wasn't as satisfying as I thought it was going to be. Or wisdom, he talks about wisdom being like, he sought after wisdom, and he gets to the end of that as meaningless. And they say, well, let me just try pleasures. And he talks about madness and folly, and he says that's meaningless too. So all of these things he concludes are meaningless. I came across this article earlier this week. Many of you will probably recognize the name Jim Carrey. So he's an actor and comedian. He's acted in movies like Dumb and Dumber and The Mask and Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. And right now you're probably sitting here going like, how in the world is he going to connect the dots between Dumb and Dumber and this book about wisdom? And I'm with you, hang on for a second. But this quote from Jim Carrey, he says, I think everybody should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of so they can see it's not the answer. He's like that, like if people could just see all that you dreamed of is not the answer. And you can see this all the time. You see celebrities and you're like, well, how did that person kill themselves? They had everything. And they have everything maybe from a physical standpoint, like an earthly standpoint, but everything from an earthly standpoint without God is nothing. So they're rich in nothing. And as I read that, I was like, that's pretty good wisdom from the Dumb and Dumber guy in a major way. And his point and the point that you see in Solomon is very similar. In these first few chapters, like all these things that you could dream of, wisdom, wealth, like success in work. Solomon built all these buildings and things that are pretty impressive. But without God, it's nothing. And we know from reading about Solomon in other places, he had all of these foreign wives, and he left God, and he was not living with God. And God tells him about the punishment that his generations after him are going to see because of that. But like you can kind of see like this person who's writing this thing probably has some bitterness there, is because he's given up what he had that was meaningful, and he's taken on all these things that are meaningless. And it's just a reminder, like as we think about the last study that Caleb was taking us through on the Sermon on the Mountain of just storing up treasures in heaven. The treasures down here are going to fleet. They're not the same as, and they're not of the value that we have with the treasures in heaven, with loved ones that are going to be in heaven with you, people that you can kind of reach for the gospel, things that you've done for the kingdom, that just they're never going to go away. So we're going to keep going now. We're going to start in back in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. If I can get somebody to start with, read verses 17 through 26. Does he sound frustrated here? What's got him frustrated? What are some things that have him frustrated? All his wealth. We needed to be the wealthiest person. Yeah, I always thought, like in the story of Job, that like he multiplies all these things Job had. He did not multiply the number of wives he had, and you could probably put that as spouses as well, like, because I'm sure like one wife and one husband is enough for everybody. But like, what's he frustrated about? Yeah, there's a couple things here. One, like there's that song you always hear, those like there's no U-Haul behind a hearse, or you can't take it with you, which are kind of funny statements. But like all he did, he's not taking it with him. Like this ends at the end of this life, and this is he's got this because statement in here, where he says, seeing that I must leave it to someone who will come after me. And who knows whether this person will be wise or a fool. So he has no idea. What he probably knows is, he knows a couple things. He knows he's going to die. He knows he's got to leave it all behind. And he knows he's at enough of like an end of point in his life. He probably knows that God's going to take the kingdom from him. Because God tells him, back in 1 Kings, he tells him, because of you turning away from me and having all of these foreign wives, the kingdom's going to be ripped away from the generations, but I'm going to wait until after you're gone. So he can look here. His son, like when his son takes over, Rehoboam takes over the kingdom, he's 41 years old. So his son, he probably also, like as he's at the end of his life, his son's probably old enough where he's been like, this is not looking good for me, to pass this along. So he may even be frustrated, like he can see some of the lack of wisdom that's there, versus he's comparing to him. He's been blessed with all wisdom here. So I think he's frustrated for a number of reasons. And then you can throw on top of that, he sees himself as, I did all of this, and this person's going to come after me, and they didn't do all of this at all. And certainly I can see that from a human perspective, that would be disappointing. You can't take it with you. So, but again, like if we go back to storing up treasures on earth is not where it's at. Storing up treasures in heaven is kind of where it's at. So this is kind of like the negative corollary to what Jesus is saying there. Rehoboam, who's going to come after him, that's his son. With him, he's going to have the kingdom divided pretty quickly. It's going like there's frustration in the northern kingdom about taxes and all of these things, where Solomon, as he built all these great things and he kind of took over lands that were adjacent to him, like he had taxes, like taxes had to pay for all these buildings and all these things there, and they felt overtaxed. And Rehoboam, like, who was taking advice from some of his friends and peers and others, he said, let's tax them more. And they taxed them more, and it caused frustration, and the kingdom ended up being divided into the northern kingdom, which is the kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom, which is the kingdom of Judah, and that's what he ruled over. And ultimately, there's going to be civil war, and then even after that, there's going to be exile. The Babylonians and folks are going to come in and take over and take them out of their land. So you can kind of see this path forward of things just don't look good. And if you're Solomon, and if you kind of had your eyes opened a bit here, of God told me things aren't looking good for it, you can see why he'd be really, really frustrated here to do that. The other thing I'd say about Rehoboam is when you think about like this person coming after Solomon, he's doing a lot of the things he saw his father do here. He's going to do more evil than that of his fathers or their fathers, like just the people in general. In 1 Kings it says they built high places to worship other gods and practice all sorts of immorality. So you can just see where the country is going, or where the nation is going for them at this point in time as well. And in verse 24 of that 1 Kings section, he says, they did according to the abominations of the nations which the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And that's one where, like, if you put that in there and say, like go way, way back in history and say, God drove out all of the people, all of the enemies of Israel as they went into the promised land. So all of them are removed. And he tells them, don't intermarry. Like, and he's looking at them going, don't intermarry because I don't want you to kind of worship other gods and kind of, God's a jealous God, and look what all God had done for them. So what they're going to go do is they're going to turn away all of that and almost make that a meaningless thing, because they're going to take on all these abominations that the people that God has already driven out, they're going to take those on, and that's how they're going to live. So all of what God's done, they've kind of almost made it meaningless because they've thrown it all away. They had everything, and they threw it all away for something that's meaningless. And again, you can kind of see this point of, I see why Solomon's writing this, why he sounds bitter, he sounds frustrated. In verses 17 through 23, if we come back to the text here, he's talking about, he's handing over everything he's built, everything he's accomplished to somebody who could be a wise or a fool. And we know in this case he's going to be a fool. And in verse 24, we get down to this prelude to the solution. So if you look at everything that kind of has been going on for now, like it's been kind of this science experiment of what has meaning, what makes for a meaningful life. And he's kind of gotten to what makes for a meaningful life: not work, not wisdom, not pleasure apart from God. So these things are kind of dead ends overall. But in verse 24, let's come back to the text here. What does he say? So he's getting a bit here with, be content with what God's blessed us with. Like, apart from that, there's not much else that's going to be here. So he's going to come and reinforce this a bunch at the end, but there's a bit here about just contentment, finding contentment in just what God's blessed us with, whether that's good, bad. This next chapter we're going to get to like, there's seasons of good and bad that just have a time, and not everything's all good and not everything's all bad. But apart from God, who can have enjoyment? It's temporary or fleeting. Or who can have lasting joy apart from God? This is not health and wealth gospel, so we shouldn't look at this as this whole section here is all the good people are going to be blessed with greatness, and the bad people are going to be given toil and everything. When he goes through here, he says, apart from him, who can find enjoyment? Like, we can find enjoyment and we can find joy in God. He gets to verse 26 here. He says, "For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to those who pleases God." I'd say this is where I get to the it's not health and wealth gospel. In our lifetimes, he hasn't given the one who pleases him all goodness, all joy, all wisdom. We go through trials. We go through bad times. We live in a broken world and a world that has sin in it. So we're not going to live in a world where everything's good all the time. And we also see times where people who are sinners, they look like they're winning. They look like they're kind of having all the good happen to them. And the Jews saw that as well back in their time here. But if you take a longer term, eternal view of this, you could say that the sinner is going to gather and collect. They're going to give up everything. Anything that's been gained by the sinner is going to be given up for an eternal death. And if we kind of connect back to the Sermon on the Mount again, from a spiritual sense, like those who mourn, those who are meek, like all of those Beatitudes, they're going to inherit the kingdom. So we've got like if you take the eternal view, not the hey, what happens in this life view, then we're seeing this like absolutely like there's a handing over of the keys to the kingdom to the person who puts their faith in God. Even to the physical sense here. So so that was kind of from a spiritual sense, but from a physical sense, I think there's another thing here, which is if we get back to Solomon's frustrated. And Solomon's frustrated because he knows he was the sinner in this case. He was the one that was kind of apart from God and living a life outside of God, and he's going to give it up. It's going to be given up to somebody who didn't toil over this, and it's probably going to be given up to somebody wiser than him. So he's looking at this. You could also say from a physical sense, Solomon's dealing with the fact that he's sinned in his life, and he's going to have this thing ripped away from him based on what God's told him. I'll pause here. Thoughts from this ending part of chapter 2? Yeah, if you can't hear, Ike said it's almost like you could see Adam saying a lot of these things because Adam walked in the garden with God, and he experienced perfection, and then after the fall, he heard what God said. You're going to toil, and work's going to be a toil, and it's not going to be a joy in all of these things. So he saw like perfect, and he sees after the fall, and then Ike went on to say that for us, when we see all of the end come in eternity, we'll be able to go through and say, oh man, that's how it was supposed to be. I think that's an excellent point because he's going to do the things he saw his father did, and he saw his father do everything. He built the best things. He had the most wealth. He had the most wisdom. Like he had people coming to talk to him, but he lived a life that wasn't a godly life as well. Yeah, if you didn't hear that, she said, what your children see you do, they will do in excess. Um, yeah, yeah. It definitely, like, parenting is hard. Other thoughts? And yeah, and I agree with you. We've got so many other scriptures. At the end, he's going to actually kind of say, fear God and do what he says is how we please him. But having a relationship, loving God, serving God, and we've got so many places that we can turn to say, like, pleasing God. I think what he can tell us is he knows what he's been doing has not been pleasing to God. And if we put any of these things he's talked about, if this becomes the way we live our life, where this is like work, pleasure, like like we can make anything we want ahead of God, like a God, and compete with God. Like we could, like you think loving your kids, and like, how can that be bad? But like we could say, I'm gonna do everything for my kids, and we're gonna go, like, we're not gonna be in church because we're like trying to get them involved in all the sports and get them involved in everything that they can do, and they're so busy they don't grow up knowing about God, which reinforces your point of it's to an extreme. Like maybe they don't even know church. So, but anything we put in front of God is not going to be pleasing to God, and we can see that in so many places. But that's an excellent point. Other thoughts? So, if we paused here, we'd be kind of frustrated because we don't really have like the answers, and that's why I say, like, hang on. Like as we get into chapter 11 and chapter 12, this thing really starts to kind of get to, here's the answer. Here's where some of those things come to kind of, here's what you apply from this. But the main points that we've gotten to so far is, apart from God, nothing we do is going to matter. It's all going to be meaningless apart from God. And then the other point I would say is, store up treasures in heaven, because everything we have here is going to go to some, like, it's going to rust, it's going to perish, it's going to go to some next generation. It's not worthwhile. We can't take it with us, but we can take people with us, and that's an awesome thing. So now we turn to chapter 3. Now, chapter 3, this is probably one of the most known sections of Scripture. It's certainly probably the most known Ecclesiastes verse. It's probably one of the more known in the whole Scripture. But chapter 3, verses 1 through 8, this is it made popular. They added this to a song back in the 60s by the Byrds. It was called Turn, Turn, Turn. I'm not going to go through the EL thing of singing it or anything like that, so I'll save you that one. But that was a #1 Billboard hit in 1965, so like that was a big deal. Like a lot of people heard the truth mentioned here, probably in a different context altogether, kind of more focused on peace and kind of dealing with all the tensions that were happening at that point in time. But Solomon's going to start this section with another thesis statement. And his thesis statement for this one's right in the first sentence. And he says, there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven. What do you think of this statement before we actually just kind of get in and read it? Everything in moderation. What else? Yeah, I don't think he's saying like there's a time like for everything to be good. Like he's not stating like, hey, everything's good, like you can do everything. He's certainly not saying that, but kind of when you think back over time, and certainly as he's reflecting, there's a time for war. There's time for fighting, which certainly if you kind of look back through even our history, you could say, oh yeah, that was time to pick a fight. Then that was something righteous and good to do. there's a time for being at peace. So as he goes through here, like there's a bunch of these things. He's going to go through 14 contrasting statements, and they're kind of set up in pairs here. So very poetic, and maybe you could say the 14 contrasting statements. They're 7 pairs because they're almost written in these pair statements. We know from studying Revelation that 7 is sometimes used to represent completeness. I don't know if these are like the completeness of everything you could go through in life here, but maybe that has something to do with it. But before we get going further, can I get somebody to read chapter 3, verses 1 through 8? Thank you. What are some of the things we notice about the relationships or some of the words here? We already talked like at each line is like a contrasting statement or a polar opposite, but what are some of the other things we notice? Right. So being patient is required. What about like even just the words and how he's written out the words? Any things we see in the relationships of the words? There are a couple of things that were interesting to me when I was reading it. So one, there's just the pairing of these things. They're kind of like if you just kind of say good and bad, there's like a good and a bad in each of these things. So like a time to be born, you might think of that as good. A time to die, kind of bad maybe, or like a positive negative thing. But then when you look at it, you're like verse 1, a time to be born and a time to die. And then a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. You can kind of say like good, bad, so like positive, negative thing. But then the second little grouping of these, bad, good. Like in that one, it's a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. And then the next one, it's bad, good. And then you got a good, bad, and then a good, bad, and then a bad, good. And then the last one here is a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. And you can see like the first half of this little pairing of verses is good, bad, and the second half of this is bad, good. So like they're not, like as you read them, it's kind of a randomness. And as I was getting through there, I was like, it would have been interesting to me if everything was like good, bad, good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. It's kind of predictable, but I wonder here if he's kind of got, sometimes it's good, bad, sometimes it's bad, good, sometimes it's mixed. There's a randomness to life. Yeah, maybe that. I'll just more putting it in like some of these words have more of a positive connotation than a negative connotation. Yeah. It's not always bad. They just are like
These aren't blanket good, quote unquote good bad. These are just dichotomous. These are one extreme to another extreme, but neither of those extremes necessarily are a bad thing.
they're just like the more just the connotations and the way even like if you were going through a war, you'd probably say, man, this is bad. Like people are dying and things that are happening. So there's a randomness that occurs, and I'd say in life, there's a randomness. It's not always predictable that things are always good in this season. Like there's a time for something, and maybe he's getting a bit of the randomness of things, and that things don't all fit into something that we could go through and say, boom, it's always going to be like this. We're always going to be at peace, or we're always going to have love, life, like all these things that are there. Relational, could be.
Well, fair and so, I mean, there's none of that thing. They're tearing away what is
It's not.
not meant to be there, sewing up the, yeah, right. Followed immediately by a time to be silent and a time to speak. There's nothing more profound than to be silent when you need to. You
Yeah,
know what I mean?
no, I do. I totally do.
Good thing, but,
I do.
So I think you're right. I think there's so much more here than just that surface, like, oh, yeah, I see the contrast, but it's so much deeper
Yeah.
than that.
Good, very good points. Jerry, you were going to say something? Yeah. Yeah, we got Elton John playing in the background here. Yeah, you can definitely see that. And I mean, even the first two ones, a time to be born and a time to die, that's kind of humans and animals go through that. And then the very next one, plants, a time to plant, a time to uproot. And that's kind of what plants go through, is like their birth and death. But like even the uprooting of the plant is feeding the person, feeding somebody there. So there's definitely cyclical. Yep. That is our lot in life in a fallen world, not the perfection that God intended for us. Willie. Yeah, and I had this written later in my notes here. I'm not going to do the EL thing of skipping through notes because I will lose myself here. But you kind of also just get the in Romans when Paul says God uses all this stuff for the good. Like God's going to be able to use death, life, war, peace. He's going to be able to use it all. So like whatever we're doing, like we're not going to skirt us off the path of where God's ultimate eternal. Yep. That's right. Keeping going. Did I miss somebody? Yeah, and some people look at that and say how he's written this like, because there's a lot of debate in this. It kind of seems fatalistic in some ways there. No, but if you kind of take a bigger picture view here and say, like, eternity, like, nothing we're doing is going to take us off from God's plan for eternity. Like, we may take some paths along the way, but God knows where things are going. So God's not controlling every step that we take here. We certainly have free will, but we're not. Our free will is not going to take God off from His plan of redemption for people. Yep. It is a lot of times. Yeah. I like the word Jan just said with it's comforting to know some of this stuff's going to happen. It's not always going to be rosy, but there's going to be a sunny day, and there's going to be a rainy day, and it's okay. That's life. And I think the application for us as Christians, remember, Solomon doesn't have everything revealed to him right now. He doesn't know Christ is returning. He doesn't know the redemption plan or any of this. We've got the benefit of we know all this. And somebody was getting into it earlier. I think Willie was saying our joy and happiness should not be tied to circumstances. We know all these circumstances are going to exist, but like our joy shouldn't be, all right, when it's peace, I'm good. When it's life, I'm good. When it's this, I'm good. We're going to go through it all. And that's part of our witness to others is how we live in this life that has all these different circumstances in it, through the good and the bad. Yeah, overcoming these things and living. That's right. So there's a lot, like, and this is where I get to it and say, this isn't a fatalistic look at life. Like, these things happen in life, and it's how we live, how we respond to these things that really matters. Let's keep going, and if I can have somebody pick up verses 9 through 15. All right. So he asks this rhetorical question again. He comes back to, what do we gain for all this toil? What do we get for this life that we live? And remember, toil, the first time toil is used in the Bible is when Adam and Eve sinned. And God's talking to them and describing what work's going to be life. So it's interesting that it just kind of comes back here, this word toil. But he's going to describe this burden. He says, I've seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. In some folks it says, I've seen the burden, or there's this burden here. And he's going to describe the burden in these next verses. And I think these are also beautiful here. He says, somebody tell me what he says in verse 11. So you get this picture of frustration here. Like, this is the wisest person that's ever walked in Solomon. So but he doesn't know. Like he said, I cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. Even though he's this wise, he can't do that. But these statements are pretty awesome. He talks about he's made everything beautiful in his time. I'd mentioned Romans 8:28 earlier. You kind of see this picture of, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. You kind of see like all these things are going to be able to be useful in our lives. And then he goes through and he sets this next statement. He says, God has set eternity in the hearts of men, which I think we can all feel that. I mean, you look across the world and everybody's got some God-shaped hole in their heart. And it's just like they fill it with a bunch of different things. Like some other people fill it with different religions. Some people fill it with work or with all these things that Solomon's describing here that are empty. But people know. In Romans chapter 1, verses 19 through 20, Paul talks about this. He says, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they're without excuse. Everybody's got this empty hole, and they're looking. They know there's something out there. They know there's God. It's just where do they put their hope? Do they fear? But it's not that they don't have a reason. You can't look out there and say, like I look at this thing, and I say some man made it, or some machine or some person made this thing. You can't look at us, and you can't look at the plants or anything that happens, the sun rising, the sun setting. You can't look at anything you can see and say, somebody didn't make it. And that's what, like in Romans, when Paul's talking about it, you're without excuse. You know there's a creator because you see creation. We see this creation, and nobody disputes there's a creator. You see that creation, and nobody really has a reason to dispute there's a creator. It's our kind of stubbornness that would force us to say, like, I don't want to put my knee down. I don't want to say somebody's greater than me. I don't want to say someone's greater than me than this. So people all, like as Solomon's talking, they've got eternity in their heart. And then this third point he made here, he said, yet they can't fathom what God's done from beginning to end. And I think this is another one of those things where you can just see this frustration. Like, we make lots of awesome things. I held up my phone earlier. Like, this is awesome technology, but it doesn't really do anything that doesn't have, like, it doesn't do anything different. Like, it can take a picture, but my eyes can see the actual thing just like it takes a picture. My brain can remember things across time. So these things can't really do that much that is different from what a human can do. But we, like you see, like companies and people, we're always trying to do and mimic and make things that like God's made, but we can't do it. Like everything we do is going to be like artificial, like some levels down from what God has created. This statement here, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from the beginning to end, it kind of puts people in their place of you're less than.
Well, you could also interpret this verse from a believer's perspective, which is he's put eternity in men's hearts, which is that hope of heaven, that promise we were talking about earlier.
Yep.
And yet, we cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. So we have the hope of heaven, we have the promise, but we are not ever going to be revealed with God's eternal, the whole time. Like, we'll never get that because we are not him, right? So if you look at it, yes, from eternity being all of mankind, or not eternity, sorry, but all of mankind perspective, you can also look at it as just a believer's perspective.
I agree.
We have the hope of heaven, but we will not be revealed.
We don't know the plan. We don't know when he's coming back. We may see, like, at the end, as Jesus returns and say, I love it when the plan comes together, and we'll see, like, all of it and say, oh, man, you can totally see how this was happening. But we don't have it. We go through life, and this is where faith comes in, and kind of seeing the reality of what's happened, but then having faith that God's going to do what he says he's going to do because he continues to do what he says he's going to do. The other point here, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 20 through 25, Paul's talking about this. He says, where's the wise person? Where's the teacher of the law? Where's the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Solomon had the most wisdom of human wisdom, but still foolishness compared to what God has there. So while he knew a lot and he'd been able to build a lot and accomplish a lot, it was far short of what God could accomplish. And if you look at where Solomon is, again, very reflective, end of life type of thing. It's frustrating. It's a burden. Like I've seen like everything, I've done everything, and now I see like I still don't know it all. God knows it all. Like and even like whatever you say about Solomon and how he lived, he has an appreciation for what like where he is relative to where God is. And I think that's wisdom, like in some respect there. So what do we do with this? In verse 12, I'd say we get an answer to that. So if we keep going here, verse 12, he says, I perceive that there's nothing better than for them than to be joyful and do good as long as they live. So he's got this application for us here. Again, we don't have to wait all the way to the end, but we see this application. So what do we do because we can't see everything? We don't know the whole plan. Be content. Be happy. Be joyful. Like read about Paul's life, and Paul's in prison, Paul's in shipwrecks, Paul's kind of in all these tough places, and Paul's saying, like, be joyful. And that's part of our witness there. In verse 13, he keeps going here. He says, also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I don't know that like somebody saying toil is our gift, but he's given us a bunch of things in this life. And we could run around and gripe about it and say, oh man, I'm going through this tough thing. Or we could just say, like, no, I appreciate it. I've got a job. I can do this. I've got air. Like, I can breathe. I can walk. Like, to appreciate the things I have. Not everybody has everything, but like appreciate what God has given us here. And in verses 14 through 15, he says, I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which has already been, has been, that which is to be, already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. Verse 14, revere God, fear God. Like that's, there was a question earlier about like, what do we do? Like, how do we please God? Like, pleasing God is fearing God, and respecting God and revering God. That's what he's done this for, is what Solomon's saying here. Thoughts on that section there? Let's keep reading it. Go, Jer. I agree with you. Like, and we already have kind of covered at the beginning of this chapter all these different circumstances that are sometimes good, sometimes bad, like however you interpret them at the point in time. But these circumstances happen in life, and our joy needs to kind of be over all of those, and kind of despite the situation, despite what we're going through here, versus finding happiness only in the good times and sadness in the bad times. Like, certainly we're going to be sad from time to time, but like just having an overarching view, which is our eternity, our retirement plan is with God. Like, that's where we're putting our, that's where we've invested our lives. Is we want to know where we're going. We want to know where our eternal life is, and thus we kind of step back and live this life when we're going through a tough time. It's like, I get it's tough, and we have that kind of eternal point of view in mind. Let's keep going into verses 16 through 25, and we'll wrap up this chapter here. If I can get somebody to read 16 through 25. All right. So this one again gets into this like fatalistic kind of space again. So it's kind of a negative way to end the chapter here. But like he starts here, he says wickedness persists. Like there's unrighteousness and injustice and wickedness where there is righteous. And we may go through that frustration all the time anyway. We may look at it and say, why is this evil persisting? Why is this happening here? Why isn't God judging this? And he says here, there's a time for that too. There's going to be a time of judgment, and it's going to be God's judgment of both the righteous and unrighteous. So instead of like looking at that, because we could easily be distracted by that and just kind of be so focused on there's evil in the world, why does this evil persist here, and get kind of caught up in that trap versus knowing God's going to take care of that. That's not my job to take care of that. My job is to witness to people and to bring more people to God with me. Along the way. So there's a time for judgment that's going to happen. And then it's verse 18. This is where it comes across, and there's debate, and a lot of people get kind of wrapped up in this section here. But in verse 18, he says that God tests them so they can see they're like the animals in some ways. And he's not saying that animals and people all have the same kind of end in life. He's making some comparison points to animals. So this is not about the spirit of animals and animal spiritual life and animals' eternity, but this is man lives and dies. Man's going to go to dust. We're going to go into the ground, just like an animal. Man and animal are both limited. Like neither of them are at God's level. Like they're all below God. So this is kind of putting men and animals in kind of some similarities. It's not saying animals and men have the same lot in life. In terms of like their spiritual life and what God's done for them through his son Jesus. Both are going to die a physical death. He's not talking about heaven and hell here. He's talking about the dust in the ground. In verse 21, he asks this question about who knows about the lot or the spirit of man and animals. We of course know the spirit of man persists, and like there's a spirit of man in heaven and there's a spirit of man in hell as options there. And that's a statement of fact that we have in Scripture. But it's very clear what he says here. Fear, if we skip to the end, and sometimes you like to read the end of a book to see how it's going to end, so you kind of keep there. The end of this book in chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes in verses 13 through 14 says, fear God and keep his commandments. So as we go through this whole thing, just keep that in our kind of mindset. And then he finishes with this other kind of point here around contentment coupled with the frustration again. And I think this frustration of not seeing what's coming after him or just knowing that he's got to give up just kind of stays with him through this. So we can see here is who can bring him to see what's going to happen after him. And thus that's that kind of like he knows something bad's going to happen after him. He's been promised that. So just wrapping up here, as Catherine said, these are some eloquently written kind of verses here. Like those first 14 or 8 verses, but 14 statements are 14 statements that are so poetic and just kind of paint a picture of life and the cycles we go through here. And we get a reminder here. our joy shouldn't be dependent on any of those circumstances. We should know that God's always in control as you go through. Like, we're not going to change his plan. His ultimate plan of redemption is there, and we just need to trust him. The next thing we see here is Solomon points out that man should fear God, meaning that we should respect him, we should worship him, we should put ourselves in our place in respect to God. And then finally, just acknowledge there's sin in the world, there's evil in the world, and there's injustice that happens. And it's not to say, like, it just happens, let it go. And it's not to say we shouldn't stand up against injustice. Just say the judgment there, God's going to judge. And we don't need to worry about that, and we don't need to question what God's doing. And if we think back before we came to Christ, we would have been in that same lot as well of being judged and being kind of given an eternal death, and we don't have that to look forward to because we put our life in Christ. So that's it for this week. We're going to pick up next week in chapter 4, but I'll pause here for any thoughts as we wrap up here. Willie. I think those are great reminders, Willie. Other thoughts? All right. Well, thanks, everybody. I'm going to close with prayer so we can get next door. Let's pray.